is a privilege to be here today, to kind of stand before you all and get to share something from God's Word. As the worship team was just leading out in that song, there's a passage of Scripture that just really came to my mind and really came to my heart, and that's in Luke chapter 19, and Jesus is going down toward the Mount of Olives, and the disciples all begin to gather around, and they say, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. You know, through this whole series, through the book of James over the last few months, we've talked about some incredible radical ideas. They seem radical to us, I think, a lot of times in our culture because they are so counter to the Christianity we have witnessed, to the Christianity that maybe we have practiced, to the Christianity that we hear preached. They sound so contrary to the culture of today. But yet, I wonder if maybe what is contrary is not what the Bible professes as real Christianity, but maybe what we're doing is contrary to true faith. Because when I look at a passage like Luke, I'm reminded that we were created and we are present and we have the breath that we have because we are called to be worshipers first and foremost. I wonder if James wouldn't seem so radical if maybe my heart was more aligned with my purpose. I wonder if it wouldn't sound that radical to sell out for the cause of Christ if I realized that's why I was created to begin with. You follow me? I wonder if that's why some of these teachings are so uncomfortable, is because we have forgotten our true calling and our true purpose. Man, I don't know about y'all, but when I think about and when I consider and when I contemplate this idea that I was created for the glory and the purpose of God, when I think about that and I begin to get my mind just a little bit around that, then a lot of these other teachings just make perfect sense. They don't seem radical at all. They seem obvious. We've talked a lot about how a saving faith will change everything in our lives. A saving faith will affect the way that we communicate with the world around us. A saving faith will affect the way that we spend our time, how we spend our money, what we do with our power and our influence, what we do with our friendships, what we do with our families. A saving faith should influence all of these things. But so often it sounds so radical because it's not what we've experienced and not what we've lived and not what we've heard preached. I want to tell you today that I think if we really understood the purpose is to glorify God with our whole heart, soul, and mind, these things would seem normative, not countercultural, not odd, not radical. Well, today we're going to be talking about how faith works in handling our resources. How does real saving faith affect the way that we spend our money? How does saving faith affect the way that we spend the things that God has given us, the gifts of material goods and things like that? And I know when we start having this kind of a sermon, as soon as we begin to talk about these things, we begin to squirm a little. We begin to get a little uncomfortable because most of us probably understand that we have work to do in this area. Most of us probably understand that there are some things that we could get better specifically in this area. But as we open the Bible today to James chapter 5, you're going to hear James talking to people that he addresses as people who are rich Now, if you're like me, you don't consider yourself rich probably. Most of us in this room consider ourselves kind of average, or maybe even below average, or we really don't see ourselves as rich. We see ourselves as just kind of average, normal people. Maybe a little well off, maybe not so well off. But most of us, when we see the word rich, we assume that the Bible is talking to other people. Amen? That's kind of the way we look at it, because we can always find people around us that have more. And so we begin to kind of believe that we get a pass on what the Bible's talking about in this particular area. But I want to make sure, before we really get into this, that we all have a proper understanding of how rich we are. Did you realize there's a website called the World Wealth Calculator, and it's been adjusted for cost of living, it's adjusted for real estate, for infrastructure all around the world. And you can go in to this website and you can put your income yearly and see how you stack up compared to the rest of the world. Now, I want to ask you real quick, if someone said, what does it mean to be rich? Let's give a percentage that you think you need to be above the average, or what percentile, like you have to be above 90% of the people in the world, 80% of the people, 70%. What's the number you think that would say, that would probably qualify someone as being rich if I was just going to take a stab at it? Give me a percentage. 60. 20. So top 20%, something like that, being richer than 80% of the people in the world. You would say, that's probably who James is talking about. Well, if you go on the World Wide Web and go to the World Wealth Calculator, you're going to find that if you make $200,000 a year, you're in the top 0.1% of the wealthiest people in this world. To put it in perspective, you're 262 times richer than the 1 billion of the lowest. If you make $100,000 a year, you're in the top 0.3%, not just the top one, the top 0.3% of the richest in this world. 131 times richer than 1 billion people. What if you make $50,000 a year? You're in the top 2.1%. You're richer than about 98% of the rest of the world. If you make $50,000 a year, you make 65 times more than 1 billion people on this earth. If you make $25,000 a year, you're in the top 8% of the wealthiest people in this world. Do those numbers surprise us today? Are those not staggering numbers? I read an article this week that said if you live in the United States of America and you are in the lowest 20%, you are on federal assistance for food, you're on federal assistance for housing, just by virtue of being born in the nation of the United States of America, who already has clean water, who already has a certain social safety nets. If you look at all of that and you take the bottom 20% of U.S. citizens, you are still wealthier than most Africans, most Asians, and a lot of European nations, just by being an American in the lowest 20%. The average, or the lowest 20% make an average of $18,500 a year. They are in the top 11% of wealthiest people in this world. I don't know about y'all, but when I look at these numbers, they surprise me. Amen? I mean, does that surprise anybody, these numbers? I think if we're not careful, we begin to look at wealth and we compare ourselves to other really wealthy people. That's like having, living in Beverly Hills and being the poorest guy in town and going, man, I am just poverty-stricken, right? Well, you're looking at everybody else in Beverly Hills. You may be poverty-stricken, but you still have a $4 million mansion. The reason I'm saying this is I think as Americans, we sometimes look at wealth incorrectly, and we read the Bible with the wrong lens, and we read the Bible through the lens of Western Christianity and not through the lens of biblical authority. And we go, God, what are you really saying? When he says it is harder for a rich man to enter into heaven, for a rich man to enter into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, I want you to understand, I think he's saying it's harder for Americans to go to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. You see, we are the rich. We're the wealthy. You may not feel like it, but we are. And so don't make the mistake of looking at what James is about to say and think he's not talking to us by mere virtue of how much money we make. By that standard, we know he's talking to us because he says the rich. But now he's going to talk about the rich and say some things that are pretty staggering about them. But I think there's still some applications that we can make if we will just let God's word really speak this morning. And so if you've got your Bibles, I want you to turn to James chapter 5, starting verse 1. We're going to read the first 6 verses, and we're going to learn some principles to handling our resources well in light of the fact that we are followers of Jesus Christ. But listen what James says. He says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you fell to pay the workers, they mowed your fields, are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." Now James is throwing out a warning here to everyone who is wealthy that fits this category in this particular day and age. Now, if you look at this, the language is crazy. You might be looking at this and going, hey, this doesn't apply to me. I don't have anything to learn from this because one thing, okay, maybe I'm rich and I didn't realize it, but I'm not someone who's opposing other people. I'm not someone who's out murdering people. I'm not someone who's withholding wages from the people I owe them to, and that's fair, but I still think there's some application that we can make even if we find ourselves not as bad off as these people. And I want to tell you, this is something that's uncomfortable, but we need to be reminded of this time to time that because God has entrusted us with so much, there is a lot of responsibility that we now have before God for how we handle these resources. And so what I want to do today is I want to give you 4 principles, if you will, about handling resources well. And the first one is this. We get in the first 3 verses. He gives this description of wealth. And he says, look, I want to warn you, you need to weep and you need to wail because something's coming upon you. He's saying judgment day is coming. And you people, he says, your wealth is rotted, moths have eaten your clothes, and your gold and silver are corroded. But get this, he says, their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. He's saying, you have all this confidence in your wealth. You have all this confidence in your income. You have all this confidence in the things that you're acquired. As a matter of fact, he even uses this idea of you've counted on these things. If you look at it, and he says, you've counted on all these things, but in the end of the day, when Christ comes back, none of this is going to really last. Do we realize that? Do we realize that everything that we have, all that we attain here, is simply temporary? Let me tell you, we will never handle the resources that God has entrusted us well until we realize that all of those resources are temporal in nature. They're temporal in nature. We need to make sure that we understand that. How many of y'all have ever rented a car, rented a house, stayed in a hotel room? Most everybody, right? Now, some of y'all don't stay in hotel rooms because of bed bugs, right? But that's a whole other story. I know a lady, man, she flips the mattresses, puts new sheets on them. I'm like, just stay in the car, you know? But anyway, how many of y'all have ever stayed somewhere? But can you imagine if you go to the hotel, let's say we're going on a trip tomorrow, and we're going to stay in the Holiday Inn Express in whatever town, okay? Now imagine right now we go to the Holiday Inn Express, and you see me walk back to the counter, and I show up at the counter, I got like, hey, we got a problem with my room. And they're like, well, I'm sorry, sir, what is it? And they're like, well, I'm going to be honest, I really don't like the color. Do you think you could get somebody to paint this thing? I mean, do you think you could get somebody to put some different linens on the mattresses? Do you think we can maybe change out that vanity? Because I really don't like the style of that vanity. They would look at us like we had done lost our minds. You know why? Because we do not own that room. Holiday Inn owns that room. Now the important distinction I'm trying to make is, as long as we walk this earth seeing ourselves as owners and not merely stewards, we will mismanage the resources that God has entrusted to us. You see, it's a whole different mentality. And James wants to make sure that people understand something. You've got a problem. You have been counting on your riches like they're going to last for eternity. But the reality is, the clothes that you're buying, these fine linens, man, moths are eating those things up. That gold and silver, they're corroding. As a matter of fact, when Jesus comes back, it ain't going to matter what you're wearing. It's going to matter about what's inside. Because the things of this earth are temporary. If we don't understand that, we're going to miss out on managing the resources that God has given us to manage. And the more temporary that we see something, then the less attached we seem to become to it. Have you noticed that? How many of y'all ever rented a car and went and got it repainted and put new wheels on it and lifted it up? Anybody ever do that? Why? Why not? I mean, I like my truck a little high. If I'm going to go to the trouble of renting one from Hertz, I'd like it to be lifted up a little. Nobody does that. Why? Because we understand it's temporary. And I think maybe one of the difficulties we have in our culture is that we treat the things of this world as if they're going to last forever, and we treat the things that will last forever as if they don't matter. Well, let's just be honest. Sometimes we treat things with permanent affection, but we treat people with temporary disregard. And James is saying you got it all wrong. These things are just going to go away. They're not going to last. They're going to rot. They're going to corrode. They're just going to blow away. They're not going to matter in the end. Handling resources well requires an understanding that the things of this life are temporary. And the more that we become stewards and the less that we become owners, the better obedience that we're going to find in our lives before the Lord. So it's a temporary thing. But number two, look right here at verses 3 and 4. He goes on and he tells us something else that's going on. Not just that these things are going to decay and rot and go away. He says, the corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. He says, you have hoarded wealth in the last days. He says, you're hoarding everything. Now the problem is not saving. We know that the Bible teaches that, hey, a fool spends all that he gets. We can see that back in Proverbs, right? We know that there is a precedent in the Bible that it's okay to save. It's okay to put back a little money that you're going to need one day. He's not prohibiting that right here. But there's something else going on with the people here. He's saying, look, you're taking all of this wealth and you're just accumulating it, and all you're doing is becoming a storehouse for more things. The problem is your money is not to be something that you store so that you can brag about how big your barns are. Your money should be utilized to further the kingdom and the agenda of God in this world. You see, because just a few verses before, he said that pure religion and undefiled before the Father is to visit the orphan and the widows in their distress. We see that there's people that are suffering and they're hurting and they're hungry and they're in need. And he says it's insane that you believe as a believer that you should hoard all this wealth while the brothers and sisters around you are hungry. You see, I think that runs so contrary to what we learn and what we live here in the United States. Amen? I mean, I'm not getting on. I love being an American. Man, I'm telling you what, I'm proud to be an American. I really am. I would rather live here than any other nation on the earth. Unless Texas was its own nation, and then definitely Texas. But that's a whole other story, right? That's a whole other story. So don't get me wrong. I'm not dogging the U.S. What I am saying, though, is culturally, I think what's happened is we've become so individualistic that we have forgotten that God didn't bless us so that we could hoard everything. God always blesses with the idea that we're going to steward that to further His kingdom in this world. You see, if we're just inlets only and we're never outlets, we are mismanaging the money that God has given us. How many of y'all ever watched that show, Hoarders? Y'all ever watched that show? There's some weird stuff on hoarders. I don't know if you've ever watched it, but I had a lady in a church one time. I don't think she's going to watch this video, so I'll tell you about her. But anyway, she was a hoarder, but she hoarded like certain things. I don't know what it was about newspapers, but she hoarded newspapers. You think, well, yeah, I'm sure she had a few of them. No, y'all, I am not kidding. This lady hoarded newspapers to the extent that before I went to her house, my deacon said, Brother Chris, you need to be careful. What do you mean? She's a 70-year-old, widow. What's she going to do to me? You could get lost. Like, what are you talking about? You have no idea. Go to her house. I kid you not. Newspapers from the floor to the ceiling with little trails you had to walk through to get around her house. That's hoarding, okay? And now newspapers are meant to be read, okay? And it's okay to save a few newspapers for when you need a little kindling on the fire, but there becomes a point where it gets unhealthy. Now, I don't know where that point is, but I'm going to tell you, I can recognize it in her. I don't know when she crossed the line. Maybe when you couldn't find the dog. I don't know. But you see, we all know that there's this unhealthy thing. And James is saying, look, when you begin to hoard things and when you begin to just consume it and you never have this outlet and the people around you are suffering and in need, but yet you just hoard more and more, build more barns up, he says. You're hoarding. And I'm going to tell you, even though we know that saving's not prohibited. I'm not trying to get there, and I'm not trying to say we just pull all our money today. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that there does seem to be a precedent that James is saying, look, something's going on in some of these people's lives, and they are hoarding wealth, and they're not using it for the God-given purpose God gave it to them to begin with. I'm not telling you specifically what that looks like in your life. I don't really want you to tell me what that looks like in my life. All I want to do is let the Spirit of God begin to work maybe in all of our lives and show us if maybe we're guilty. It begin to show us what we need to do with it. So handling resources well requires that we be outlets of resources and not simply inlets. But look at the third point here. Handling resources well requires that we gain them with integrity. Look down at verse 4. He says, there's another problem going on right here. He says, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Now, this is a crazy picture. He says, God himself is hearing people crying out about your injustice in the way you dealt with them. There's laborers who are serving some of these people, and for whatever reason, you've hoarded it and you haven't paid the people that you owe money to. And he says, and those people are crying out. And get this, they reach the ears of God. Now I want to tell you, I don't want to get too preachy here. But there should be one group of people in any community that everyone knows you will always have fair dealings with, and those are followers of Jesus Christ. Period. Let me ask y'all something, though. Do you think that's probably the reality that the community at large sees? I'm just asking. One time I was dealing with a contractor on some things for a church, and when he shook my hand and found out I was the preacher of the church, he said, "Oh, got to watch out for you." What do you mean? He said, I've learned my lesson. I've been burned too many times by pastors. And so I just set out on a whole agenda to change his mind on what pastoring should really look like when you deal with business. You see, I've heard other people who are bankers who have said, you got to watch out for these three types of people. And pastors make the list because consistently we see that people that profess to know Christ seem to deal with business one way and then preach something else from the pulpit. But I'm going to be honest with you. I think we do the same things. I think sometimes we say things from the pews, but we don't practice it in our businesses. And James is saying, I want you to know something. That is dead wrong. And if you think that it's just staying between you, or you just think it's just business, you need to understand something. That injustice is reaching up, and God himself is hearing it. Can't tell you how many times over my life of growing up in church, of being someone who grew up in construction with my dad and listening to different people in different churches. I'm going to tell you something. I've heard this repeatedly. well, this is business. This is different. Let me tell you, I see nowhere in Scripture where we get to segment our lives and be dishonest over here and have integrity over there. I don't see it. And if it's just business has ever been uttered from our mouths to disregard or be dishonest or be a little underhanded, we need to understand we are in error, and God knows that. There should be no place that people have a fairer, more gracious, more honorable deal than when dealing with the people of God. And I want to tell you something. You know this, and I know it too. All it takes is one really bad experience with someone in a church, and they have washed their hands of that church from this point forward. I'll tell you, I'm going to be honest. There are people right now that I hear time to time, and there was one just recently. This is the thing about being a pastor. You get to hear all this, right? Just recently, I'd love to come visit y'all's church, but I know so-and-so. And they're dishonest in how they do their business. And I'll never go to a church where they do. Now, you may say that person's got a problem. You may say this, you may say that. But here's the thing. Regardless of their rationale, if it's true, it's a problem. And so James says that you need to understand, so if you're going to handle your resources well, then you need to make sure that you're doing it with integrity. You should gain everything you have with integrity. It's just business should never be uttered from the mouth of a believer in Jesus Christ. Ever. Not in that way. And then he moves on. Look down at verse 6 at what he says. He says, or actually, look back at verse 5. He says, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Now the word luxury and self-indulgence, the words there, he's saying, you've lived your life on earth kind of soft. He says, that's what you were really looking for. Your goal was kind of to just live a soft, easy, comfortable life. He says, that's the problem that he's seeing with these particular people. They were just living a luxurious, soft, comfortable, easy-going life. What can I do to make sure that I'm comfortable? What can I do to make sure that I have it easy? What can I do to make sure that me and mine are taken care of? Because that's kind of the mentality going on here. And he says, this is what's going on. But what you've actually done, he says, is you fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. He says, the more that you've accumulated so that you can be comfortable and easygoing and you can have a nice, smooth life, and the less you've helped the people around you, what you've actually done before God is to fatten yourself so that when judgment comes, you're just like a cow that's been fattened up enough to be slaughtered and sold to the highest bidder. Does that imagery is just powerful. He's saying that's what's going on. People are just, what can I do to be comfortable? What can I do to have more? What can I have to get my family taken care of? And I think a lot of that is going on in our culture. And here's what I mean by that. I heard a statement a few years ago at a conference, and it just really shook me. It said this. It said, many people struggle because we have traded the Great Commission of the New Testament for the American dream. And when we did that, we forfeited the calling of God on our lives. How many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, when it comes to our finances, our goals are not spiritual in nature at all? Just be honest, right? Isn't this a comfortable sermon? Don't you love this one? I hate this one. I do. How many of us, if we're really honest, we hope to get a raise, we hope to get a promotion, we hope to get that contract. But it's not with a spiritual thing in mind. It's so that we may gain something more for us, so that we may increase our standard of living. I heard someone say one time, the next raise you get, instead of thinking that God was wanting to increase your standard of living, maybe he was trying to increase your standard of giving. How many of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't look at life that way, amen? We just don't. It's okay to say, amen, you're right, that stinks. We're not good at that. How many of us look at the next raise or the next this or the next that? Hey, my stimulus check's coming in the mail. I can't wait. Buy that new four-wheeler, right? How many of us have maybe traded the great commission of reaching the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in its place, put as our main priority, how can we live the most comfortable, easy life we can get? I wonder, guys, this isn't something that I've got sorted, okay? I'm going to be honest with you. This is something that, heck, I work in the medical field. There's a little bit of money to be made in the medical field, I'll be honest. And it's so easy to get sidetracked. It's so easy to begin to think, ooh, I could get this, I could get that. If I worked a little extra, I'll tell you a little secret. Medical folks, we don't look at stuff like how much does it cost. We look at how many shifts that costs, okay? I don't know if you know that. Like we get paid in 8-hour shifts, 12-hour shifts. I'm like, that's about 4 shifts. I could do that. Any medical folks are like, that's how I do. That's how I got my new TV. Shift and a half, right? Yeah. How much did that cost? I don't know. 12 hours? I don't know. It's so easy to get consumed with these things, but I want you to understand what's going on in James, I think, is going on in our world today. And I'm afraid that we have sought to live luxury and self-indulgent lives instead of lives of meaning and purpose and value in the kingdom of God. You may say, Chris, I'm not living in luxury. I'm not living in all this self-indulgent lifestyle. Let me tell you, go back to the wealth statistics and ask yourselves, is that really true? Go back and understand that 1 billion people in this world live on $764 a year or less. And ask yourselves, are we really not living in luxury? Like I said, I think sometimes the greatest challenge to this is the fact that we live in Beverly Hills and we just forgot that there are people outside of this neighborhood that are truly poor. We've gotten used to having curb streets and nice sidewalks and clean parks and great security and walls. We've gotten used to it, and so now we no longer understand just how abnormal that is on a world scale. Now the question is, what do we do with it? I mean, should we just feel guilty? Should we just feel bad? I mean, here's some dangers I think we face. Number one, I think when we hear a sermon like this, we automatically face the danger of legalism. Well, I guess then I'm going to have to give a certain percentage of my income up. I guess that's what I have to do. And so we begin to write checks based off of a percentage. Okay, I always give this much. Okay, I'll give 12%. And it becomes a percentage game, and then it becomes just this practice that has no real connection to our heart. I don't think that's what God's after either, amen? I don't think God needs our 10%. I don't think He needs our 12%. I don't think He needs our 15%. I'm not saying that giving based off a percentage is wrong. I'm just saying it can become irrelevant. It can become really disconnected from our hearts because pretty soon we're just paying a bill, right? We just pay the water bill, the light bill, and the Jesus bill. I just don't think that's what God has in mind. It says, we learn in the other parts of the scripture that He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I think what He's saying is, look, I don't really need your money, but I want your heart. I want you to prioritize your life in such a way that shows that you value me above anything else. And for some of y'all, that might be literally a 5% this week. It might be a 50% this week. I don't know, but don't get hung up on a percentage. Just get hung up on being obedient. Because legalism can get in the way very quickly when we start talking about money. I think the second thing is comparison. Well, I'm more generous than other people, right? I mean, I haven't seen that guy throw anything in the bucket in a while. I'm obviously more generous than they are. And we get in the comparison trap to where we think, well, it doesn't really matter what we do. We just want to do better than the person around us. It doesn't matter how much we give as long as we give more than the people around us. I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's the heart of the command either. And lastly, I think some of us just get guilty, and so we throw something in to make ourselves feel better. Amen? I'm not talking about the offering here at the church. I'm talking about in any place. How many of us have seen the homeless guy sitting outside a store, and we have that gut check. We think it's the Spirit. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just our own guilt because we're ordering 3 Big Macs and we only need 1, And we see the guy, and he needs something. You know what I'm talking about, right? And what do? Yeah, just going to get real right now. Y'all ready for this? Because I'm captain of this. I'm going to throw him enough that I don't feel guilty, but not so much that it costs me. Ooh, man. Am I the only sinner in the room? Am I the only one? I'm going to throw him enough in there that I feel better, but I don't, and I can sleep tonight, but I'm not going to put so much in there that it really costs me. Because I really need to buy my new truck. I really need to buy that 4-wheeler. I really need to buy the boat. I really need this. I'm going to throw something in there, but I'm not really going to get to the heart of what he needs. And I'm not saying you got to give your paycheck to the guy at McDonald's. He may be a scam artist. I don't know. I'm just saying how it works. So we're motivated by guilt. That's not the motive either. So what do we do? There's 4 questions I want you to ask today as we close. Chris, y'all come on up if you want to. 4 questions as we close that I want to give you from this passage that I think we all need to answer. Number 1 is this. Do I see my income, my resources, as something that I'm a steward of or something that I own? I think if you can't answer that one, the rest of them don't matter. Do I see my income as something that I'm simply a steward of or something that I own? It's okay if you say, well, I see it as something I own. It's okay. It's okay to be wrong. It's just not okay to stay there. Amen? It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to have that, but don't stay there, because that's not the Bible. You see, every good and perfect gift comes from above, coming down from the Father of lights. See, the way I read the Bible is nothing I have is truly from my own making. It comes from the hand of a gracious and almighty and merciful God. That comes from my salvation, to my children, to my pocketbook. It's all a gift from God. And the more that I see myself as the owner, the more selfish that I tend to be with it. The more that I see myself as a steward, the more clarity I have in how to manage it. I've always heard it's a lot easier to spend other people's money, and that is true, amen? It's a lot easier to be generous when you realize the one that gave it to you is the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and if he sees fit, he'll give you some more to do some more of that with it. One of the things I've talked to people in this church, people that you would consider wealthy, I consider wealthy. They told me, you know what, the secret, the greatest thing that I've ever unlocked with wealth is the power of giving it away. There's power in seeing that we are just channels for God's goodness to flow to people around us. I wonder, I don't know about y'all, but I feel kind of crummy about myself right about now. I really do. But I do wonder when we stand before God one day and he says, look, I put all of this in your favor. What did you do? I cannot help but believe, as people who are probably in the top 10 to 15% of wealth, that we're not going to be accountable for those resources he gave us. So do I see myself as a steward or as an owner? Number 2, the second question is, am I hoarding or am I generous with my income? Am I someone who hoards it up? Am I someone who's just trying to reach a certain number? I had a really good friend that I went to seminary with. I love God's sense of humor. It's so much fun when it's working with other people and not me, right? But this particular man, he was about 40 years old when I met him. His name was Tim. His name is Tim. He didn't change it. But anyway, his name's Tim. And Tim was in seminary with me. And seminary is not where you go to get rich. I'm going to just clue you in. If you thought seminary is where you go to gain wealth, that is not at all the right track. But Tim had been a successful businessman, and he said, my goal was to become a millionaire before the time I was 35 or 40 or whatever it was. And he said, and I just looked up one day, and my children were getting older. And I just looked at my life and goes, is this really all there is to life? Is this really all there is? This is just pursue and hoard it up. He said, and I was just a small amount away from becoming that millionaire that I had sought to be since I was 20-something years old. And I gave it up, and I've never been happier. You see, there's joy in finding your purpose. Here's the crazy thing. Your purpose may be to be a millionaire. God may very well have called you to be the one who has the wealth to be generous. And we're like, I wish God would have assigned that to me. Amen, right? But he doesn't. It's not about wealth being wrong. It's about how we utilize it. And you can utilize wealth incorrectly, whether you're making billions or whether you're in the poorhouse. But am I hoarding or am I generous with my income? Number 3, am I Am I a person of integrity in my business? That's an important one today. Am I a person of integrity in my business? And number 4, lastly, am I striving for comfort or commitment? If your goal and my goal is how can I be comfortable? How can I have a life of ease? How can I have this? How can I have that? I'm going to tell you, I think we're going to miss the mark that God is calling us towards. God, how can I just be obedient? God, as I look at my check this week, God, how can I be obedient and faithful with what you've blessed me with? I hear people all the time, too often for it to be a coincidence. We find our greatest joy when we begin to have the joy of giving away what's been entrusted to us. Now, here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to go home and decide what your neighbor needs to give. I don't want you to go home and decide what brother so-and-so needs to give. We need to go home and ask God, what is it you want me to give? God, what is it you want me to do in light of seeing this passage today?